Welcome to the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum's webinar event, Apprentice Demand in the Top 10 Red Seal Trades. My name is Cecilia Rayburn and I will be your host. If you have any thoughts on this webinar, we'd love to hear them. Please share your thoughts by tweeting to us at CAF_FCA or on Facebook at CAF Apprenticeship, or send us an email to info@caf-fca.org. The Canadian Apprenticeship Forum is a non-profit organization that collaborates with apprenticeship stakeholders across the country to develop research insights and to promote apprenticeship training. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest presenter today, Adam Sawinski, a partner with Prism Economics and Analysis. Thank you, Adam, for joining us.
Thank you, Cecilia. And thank you, everyone. As Cecilia mentioned, my name is Adam Sawinski. I'm partner with Prism, and it's my pleasure today to walk you through highlights from a recently published report by the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum about demand for journey persons and apprentices in the skilled trades. Now, while there's lots of good, timely information out there, various sources about trades and occupations, there has really been little in the way of information about that specifically speaks to demand for journey persons and the training requirements to develop those journey persons. The questions that we really want to answer and have been grappling for the last few years working with CAF is try to come up with research that can tell us about how many apprentices do we really need, specifically in what trades do we need them and when. And all of this is to ensure the long-term sustainability of Canada's skilled workforce. So as I mentioned, we have been working on this research going back to about 2013. And all of this research has really culminated over the last month at the release of the National Labor Market Report. And so I want to take the time, because this is relatively new research and new approach, I want to take some time today to provide you with a bit of background about the objectives and the unique approach that we've taken to try to answer some of these key questions. I want to certainly take the time to walk you through some recent trends in apprenticeship registrations, completions, and outcomes. And this is based on the most recent apprenticeship data available from Statistics Canada's Registered Apprenticeship Information System database. And that data is current to 2017. I also want to take the time to talk about, obviously, the results and what the analysis reveals about workforce certification requirements. Again, how many journey persons are we likely to need to maintain the share of certified journey persons in our workforce, and compare this to the anticipated number of journey persons we expect given recent trends in registrations and assumptions about completions over the next 5 and 10 years. All of this will bring us to a discussion of some of the gaps between supply and demand, which we've identified in the research. And what's really unique about this research is, for the first time, we're not just talking about demands, that there's a demand for skilled trades, and that there's constantly a need, but we're actually able to pinpoint some of and bring attention to some of the trades that might actually be at risk relative to others, and then specifically in which provinces as well. So we're very excited about the outcomes of this research and what that tells us about industry requirements at that level of detail. Finally, we'll close with just some comments and a couple of questions that I will try my best to answer. So with that, let's start off a little bit about the background and what led to this research. Aging demographics, this is nothing new, but they have been simmering, and they have really started to exacerbate some of the labor market challenges and skill shortages that we're seeing in different sectors of economy. And what this has really prompted a lot of information and advances in labor market information to better track jobs and employment. But again, little has been done on the assessment of demand for trades training and specifically qualifications. So what we're really doing with this approach is trying to flip the labor market information paradigm upside down and really trying to track the demands for the qualifications themselves as a representation of skills. And the reason this is really important and has often resulted that I guess we've seen skills mismatches develop in different sectors is because of the long duration of time and training that it takes to train a certified, skilled individual. And that combined with the cyclical nature of employment in skilled trades, especially in sectors like construction, is what has really contributed to development of mismatches in some trades, and really caused us to try to focus here on the qualification itself rather than the job. So that's really where the system that we're using, the Canadian system for tracking apprenticeship and qualifications that was developed by Prism Economics in collaboration with CAF to really try to focus in on using this traditional and wealth of knowledge we have about labor market information, tracking demands for specific occupations, and extending that to looking at tracking demands for certifications for the individuals in those trades, as well as in other occupations and trades as they move through their careers. And all of this, again, the objective of this research is to provide apprenticeship or industry and other apprenticeship stakeholders with some analysis and projections of requirements ahead of time. So, the community and industry can respond ahead of actually meeting these demands in ample time. And the central question that we're asking here, and that's also important to understanding the results, is the question we're asking is how many new journey persons are needed and when to sustain current rates of workforce certification. So again, we're not talking here about we're not setting a target that 100% of the workforce needs to be certified and made up entirely of journey persons, but just to sustain the share of journey persons in the workforce that we have now. How many new journey persons do we need, and then work backwards to understand how many apprentices we have to bring in and hire to meet those targets. So let's start a little bit with just background of what we're looking at here. We're focusing, we have applied this research and this analysis to some individual provinces and in individual sectors over the last few years as we've refined this methodology. But this is the first time we're looking at this in a pan-Canadian perspective. So we're looking across all provinces, but we're focusing the research on the top 10 red seal trades, just trying to limit the scope to understanding trends in the largest trades, which account for about 52% of apprenticeship registrations in Canada. As you can see here, we're looking specifically at construction electrician, carpenter, welder, steam fitter, pipe fitter, automotive service technician, industrial mechanic or millwright, heavy duty equipment mechanic, plumber, cook, and hairstylist. The largest trades as of 2017 by registrations remain construction electrician, carpenter, and auto technician. So when we're talking about trends, let's start with recent trends in apprenticeship activity and going back a little bit before we go forward. Now, although there are many measures of apprenticeship activity, new registrations are important in terms of a measure of current demand as well as a lead indicator for future supply. And there are also, I want to put your attention to some important relationships between employment, new registrations, as well as completions. So this chart here shows you an index of those three. The gray line, the dotted line along the bottom is trends in trades employment. The red line that you see are registrations, and blue line is completions. So what we immediately noticed in our review of trends is the tight correlation between new registrations and changes in employment. And this was really emphasized during the economic cycles, and especially during downturns. And you can see, it's illustrated quite clearly here, where we had a downturn in 2008 and 9 during the previous downturn. You saw a significant decline in new registrations in the top 10 red seal trades. In fact, they were down about 27% in a single year from the recent peak then in 2008. And what we saw following that decline was registrations did begin to come back as employment returned to a period of growth. They continued to grow right up to about 2014, where we saw the next downturn, which was driven by the collapse in oil and resource prices that occurred in 2014 and 2015. That really marked the end of a decades-long resource expansion. Now, most of that decline was concentrated in the West, in Alberta specifically, and also in parts of Atlantic Canada. But as you can see, as in 2008, the decline in employment contributed to, again, about a 27% decline in new registrations, similar to 2008, but it was stretched over a 2-year period. But what's also different, what we noticed is what's different in the most recent trends and the most recent decline is we're not seeing any kind of recovery in those new registrations since that decline. And what the implications are, again, now we move into the relationship between new registrations and completions, is, obviously that completions also tend to follow the patterns of new registrations with a lag that's usually equal to the duration of the program. So how the completions were impacted was the decline that we saw in 2009 didn't materialize into a decline in completions until about 2012-13, which ironically was also the peak of the recovery in many sectors of the economy, which contributed to some of the labor market challenges and skills challenges that occurred during that time. And the risk that we're seeing now with the significant decline in new registrations across many programs, and the fact that new registrations have not really not coming back in any material way, this has a longer-term implications for the number of new journeypersons that are likely to be available in the years to come. And in an environment of even, let's say, anticipated to be a little bit slower employment growth environment than we had over the last decade or so, the rising number of retirements caused by an aging population, and even modest recovery in certain sectors, it puts us in a position puts many trades in a potential position of a return to risks and shortages as the number of new journey persons available each year falls and remains low. So let's move on to get a clear picture of what this looks like and how the declines played out across the country. You can see the impact of the declines, again, which were concentrated in the resource sector, were felt strongest in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, where number of new registrations dropped by about 50, 40, and 35% respectively between 2014 and 2017. If you look at Alberta, the decline that we saw there can be attributed to almost 75% of the declines in new registrations that we saw across all provinces. When we look at the declines in new registrations at a trade level, you actually see that we registered declines in almost every red seal in every red seal trade that were of the top 10 red seal trades that we're looking at between 2014 and 2017. Again, the declines were most pronounced in some of the trades that you might expect, given the declines were driven by a pullback in the industrial sector revenue. So, steam fitter, pipe fitters, welders, heavy duty equipment technicians, those are the ones that trades that we witnessed the biggest declines in new registrations. And again, those are the ones that are concentrated in, tend to be employment concentrated in engineering, construction, the industrial sector, oil and gas sector, again, the ones that saw the biggest declines. You can also see from the chart here that those declines followed some significant increases for some of those same trades during the period of expansion during 2011 and 2014. You can see that especially the case for steam fitter, pipe fitter, as well as construction electrician, plumber, and so forth. But you'll also notice that for some of the service trades, and if you look at cook and hairstylist, we saw declines in new registrations in both periods, both between 2011 and 14, as well as 2014 and 17, which again suggests if you have that long a period of new registrations declining, the tail end of that results in a decline in the number of new journey persons completing at the other end. And we'll look at some of the implications of those trends later in the presentation. So what has this done to the apprenticeship kind of landscape across the country during that period of change from 2014 to 2017? Well, as you can see, in terms of total registrations, Alberta still accounts for the largest number of apprentices. This is total registrations in the top 10 trades in Canada. Again, at 32%. So Alberta has built up an extremely large and robust apprenticeship system, and in terms of apprentices per capita, continues to lead the country in apprenticeship activity. But you'll also notice in terms of what's happened in terms of new registrations, is that Alberta has declined from accounting for about 39% of total new registrations across the 10 red seal trades in 2014, down to about 26% with the latest data we have in 2017. And this is kind of flipped with Ontario, where new registrations actually continue to rise modestly. So now Ontario accounts for about 34% of total new registrations as of 2017, compared to 26% in 2014. So if these trends were to continue, you can see Alberta's share is likely to fall in terms of total representation of total apprenticeship at a national level. We also looked at the data to assess trends in age and demographics. And what we've noticed is over the 10-year period, if we compare 2017 to 2007, the data suggests that apprentices are continuing to be older. If you look at comparing the change in new entrants over 10 years, shows you a significant drop, especially in the share of new registrants aged 20 years or younger. You can see that share has fallen from 26% back in 2007 down to about only 20% in 2017. Now, this could suggest a number of things. This could suggest that apprenticeship is now becoming more of an alternative path to employment, following other forms of employment, or more importantly, other forms of post-secondary education. So individuals might be taking other forms of post-secondary education, whether it's college or university, and then coming back to enter a trade. It could also, though, suggest there's a longer period of work before committing to a formal apprenticeship. That could be on the part of workers, of employers, but it does shift the dynamic and the demographic and the profile of apprentices, which again could have implications for the outcomes and for I guess, that their economic needs based on the age of both registrants and new registrants and completers. If we look at trends in outcomes, the number of, in terms of completions, the number of apprentices completing programs and being awarded certificates of qualification has actually been a lot less volatile when you compare it to new registrations. In 2017, Ontario and Alberta accounted for about 2/3 of all the new journeypersons certified across the provinces that we're looking at here. Ontario actually reported an increase in the number of completions of about 16% between 2011 and 2017. This has been, this increase is attributed to the continuous expansion in all sectors of Ontario's economy, but especially recent growth in construction sector and as well as service sector employment. As you see, Alberta, the number of the change in completions has also been increasing in Alberta, which has grown by about 10% between 2017 and 2011. And again, this also reflects the significant increase in registrations during the peak period of expansion. It's a little smaller than Ontario in terms of change of growth, because it also includes the period of decline after 2014, when we see a decrease in the share of apprentices being able to complete their programs attributed to the declining number of hours with weakening economic conditions. If we look at trends in completion by trade, and compare again the same period, 2011, 2017, you see trades like steam fitter, pipe fitter, cook, heavy duty equipment technician. Those are trades where we've seen some of the biggest gains in terms of the number of completions compared to 2017. The gains were largely driven by increases in individual provinces, again, notably Alberta, BC, and Ontario. But over the same period, you actually see declines in some trades as well in terms of completions. Carpenters, for example, and plumbers, we see a 30% decline in the number of new completions for carpenters, 14% decline in plumbers between 2011 and 2017. Now, an important measure in the success of apprenticeship has often been completion rates. That's the share of individuals, of apprentices that register in programs that actually go on to complete and receive a certificate of qualification. Now, individuals can agree that tracking rates of completion is one important measure of success, and calculating completion rate is useful for tracking outcomes. I might note that there are many different versions of a measure of completion rates. It's one that the Statistics Canada has recently released. Looks at the proportion of apprentices that registered in 2010 and completed their program within 1.5 times the program duration. And really, this is the key in many assessments of completion rates is the time you allow apprentices to complete. Because if you remove that 1.5 times measure, the share of individuals that actually complete eventually is a little bit higher from what you're seeing here. But as you can see, the completion rate does vary across different trades and programs. You go from close to 50% in for trades like construction, electrician, millwright, down to 25 to 30% for cook, carpenter, and a lot of this can be explained by differences in certification requirements across different provinces. and also whether trades are compulsory or voluntary. So there are many variables that can that are involved, or factors that can result in different completion rates for different trades. And why it's important is this is really a measure that we use in the system when we're trying to estimate what share of apprentices that you can register in a program will ultimately go on to complete the program and gain the certificate of qualification. So it's from that perspective that we look at these differences between trades as well as differences between provinces. StatsCan has also come up with some interesting numbers in terms of providing estimates of the time it takes apprentices to complete. On average, it takes about 3.5 years for apprentices to complete a program. However, this varies significantly across different programs, depending again on the individual trade requirements in an individual province. The time to complete can also be impacted by economic or labor market conditions. So in weaker economic conditions, again, the time it takes to complete can lengthen as the number of hours available to apprentices to meet their requirements might decline. So there are, again, many factors that can impact the length to completion. But again, it's another important variable that we look at in trying to understand when apprentices might be reaching, the end of their apprenticeship program and meeting the certification requirements, and understanding whether that timing matches up with where we estimate that they'll be needed. A final slide and a comment on outcomes. Again, Statistics Canada has been doing a great job of providing more information on apprentices, and what they've been doing recently is tracking the earnings as well of apprentices after certification by linking the RAISE data to tax files, and again, resulting in better tracking of apprentice labor market outcomes. So what this data shows here shows you earnings at completion over time in the blue bar, as well as earnings of apprentices 2 years post-certification. So the first kind of a finding, which shouldn't be too surprising, is that as apprentices gain experience following certification, their income and earnings tend to rise. We also see that earnings of apprentices at completion has been rising since 2009 steadily. But you also notice that the earnings 2 years after post-certification grew very quickly between 2009 and 2012. And that's really a function of being during an upcycle and expansionary period where skilled trades were able to maybe work more hours and getting better pay during a period of growth, which really allowed individuals to take advantage of improving economic conditions and employment growth. And so you see the spread between individuals at completion and those with 2 years experience start to grow. Now that spread started to shrink towards 2014, when some of the individuals that were completing their programs right at the end of the the resource-driven expansion completed in a period when times were beginning to contract and employment requirements. Employment was falling, the number of hours potentially available was reduced, which brought the earnings 2 years after completion closer to those at year of completion. So again, the timing of the impact, it shows really the impact of economic cycles can have on the outcomes for apprentices. So that closes the recent trends, I guess, section of the presentation. Now we really want to move into the second part, which talks about, speaks to some of the results looking at workforce certification requirements based on the research. So before we get too far to the results themselves, I want to take a few minutes just to describe some of the conceptually the determinants of demand for skilled trades. So if you visualize this, you can take this figure as a representation of total demand for skilled trades. There are a number of components that we need to consider. So the first component of demand for skilled trades is obviously changes in employment for the apprenticeable, or what I will refer to as the principal trade. So this is the trade that is tied to the program itself. So example would be carpenters. This would be change in employment for carpenters. As employment increases for that trade, so does the demand for that skilled trade. The second component that is increasingly driving hiring requirements in the skilled trades is the change related to replacement demand, or which is really the deaths and retirements in the labor force for a particular principal trade. But what makes this analysis, I think, in this research unique, is that we're also considering changes in employment for what we call related trades and occupations. And these are trades and occupations that draw on the certificate, the skills represented and qualifications represented by a certificate of qualification, or that journey person as they move through their careers into other occupations. Most often this will be a managerial or supervisory position within the trade that they're working. But this could also include, vocational trainers, as well as people in professional sales. Many of these occupations will specifically draw on the qualification of a journey person to meet the requirements. And as individuals move through their careers, they're going to take that certificate of qualification with them, and they must be replaced with new journey persons taking their spots. So this is really the unique aspect of this research that also takes account of these related trades and occupations. And again, we can't just take into account the changes in employment for those related trades and occupations. We also need to take into account the retirement of these certified workers that are working in these related trades and occupations. And this actually is even more important for related trades and occupations because they also require experience. They tend to be older than your individuals employed just in the principal or principal trade itself. So those are I think the key components, and the next what I want to talk to you about is the key driver here for both the principal trade as well as the related trade is the changes in employment, which are really driven by economic conditions and the economic outlook. So let's start with the economic outlook. This is published from the most recent Build Force Canada 2019 outlook as one of the many different inputs into the system. But what you can see from this chart here, which shows real GDP over the recent past and what we see into the future for Canada as a whole, is really the pace of economic expansion has slowed to about just over 2% in 2018 after surpassing a G7 leading 3% back in 2017, and averaging about 2.4% since the recession in 2008 and 9. Now, this recent expansion that we've experienced has been driven by a number of factors. We've got high levels of consumer expenditure. There's significant increases in permanent and non-permanent immigration to Canada, that helped spur rising residential investment. There's also increases in recovery in exports and manufacturing output. So all of those factors contribute to some of the growth we experienced over the last few years. As we look ahead, the pace of growth is expected to slow down a little bit, down below 2% per year. This is really driven by, again, a number of factors, but we've got rising interest rates, a cooling real estate market, slowing rates of population growth, and an anticipation of weaker growth south of the border in the U.S., which is a big driver for many sectors of our economy. Even during slowdown, immigration levels are expected to remain high, averaging about 300,000 per year. And this is really sustaining population workforce growth in Canada. But our growth is limited by, again, slowing residential investment, rising interest rates, further what we've seen up till now over the longer term, which can impact slower consumer spending. So all of these factors are contributing to a period of what we call, slower or more modest economic growth that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years. We also have we're expected a transition to continue from, resource construction sector investment growth to growth demands that are more driven by the needs of an aging population and rising service sector demands. So you could see growth in services and manufacturing, are now expected to outpace growth in construction, which has really been the leading driver of growth for a number of skilled trades over the last decade. And what I think this is going to result in is a shift of where we're going to see the demands for specific skilled trades. Again, the general trend that we're seeing is a trend away from in growth in terms of overall growth in employment for some of the construction trades we've seen in the past to some of the more service sector driven trades and occupations. And that's going to present a shift from what we've experienced in the past, and I think contributes to a need for more of a realignment in trades training and the emphasis in terms of where we're putting on which trades. Construction employment, although again is one of the employs the majority of skilled apprenticeable trades and the top 10 red seal trades that we're looking at, is expected to continue to rise over the near term. And we're seeing the latest Buildforce Canada outlook has employment rising to peak levels in about 2020, 2021. This will likely is expected to be driven by strong continued growth in construction demands in British Columbia and Ontario. But over the longer term, we're entering, or Buildforce expects entering a period of a plateau. So no major declines in construction employment, but staying at very high levels and shifting demands from new construction to sustaining and maintaining buildings. So again, all of these factors are taken into consideration as we're trying to understand where the demand is going to come from for which trades and when. I mentioned before that although the pace of growth is expected to slow down, so is the pace of population growth due to aging demographics. And this hits I guess, skilled trades in two ways. One, we're anticipating an increased pace in the number of retirements and age-related exits from the workforce for skilled trades. As you see from the chart here, the share of individuals in the workforce going from about age 65 and over, going from 17%, where we were in 2018, up to 22% by 2028. So that's what drives the increased number of retirements. But at the same time, you're also seeing a decrease in that 15 to 24 age category, and that's the cohort of the population where you can draw new entrants into the workforce. So as retirements are expected to rise, then the share of new entrants and the young people available to replace them is expected to fall, and that creates challenges not only for skilled trades, but all industries and demands for all occupations in Canada's economy. So that's becoming, again, increasingly important as a source of a driver of hiring requirements. So what we bring together in this chart that you see here is estimates of certification requirements for skilled trades broken out into the two components I just described. So employment demand as well as replacement certification demand. So taken together, we estimate that close to 47,000 or just over 47,000 newly certified journey persons will be required to maintain certification rates for skilled trades in the top 10 Red Seal trades. Now, as you can see here, 3/4 of that demand is attributed to this expected age-related exits of about 34 to 35,000 certified workers from the workforce. Ontario is projected to lead demand for journey persons over the next 5 years, requiring an estimated just over 19,000 newly certified journey persons, again, working directly in the 10 Red Seal trades. But Alberta and BC also have positive requirements, following with about close to 13,000 and just over 8,500 respectively. If you look at Atlantic Canada, the growth outlook is a little bit slower than in other parts of the country, partially attributed to the slower population growth and the older age demographic of provinces in Atlantic Canada. But even at generally flat employment growth, a small decline, there's still a need for a net of over 3,100 new journey persons due to retirements alone. So even in Atlantic Canada illustrates the fact that even in a period of declines in employment, hiring and training requirements remain positive. Now, if we now take the next layer of analysis, the next layer of demands to this, so in addition to the certification requirements represented by individuals in the top 10 Red Seal trades themselves, there's a demand for an additional 19,700 new journey persons that are required to meet the hiring requirements represented by the related trades and occupations that we discussed. Again, these are the related trades that draw on the existing pool of certified workers, like the managers, to meet demands for managers, supervisors, and contracting and so forth. So taken together, our work suggests that there's a need for an estimated 67,000 new journey persons required in the 10 Red Seal trades we're looking at in Canada over the next 5 years. So what is the supply side of the analysis look like? If this chart here, I think, looks similar to the chart we were looking at before, but really just provides you the number of trends in new registrants in red on top and the number of completions. So what you can see here is the decline in new registrations that we saw from 2013 brings new registrants down to levels that we saw back in 2009. And given the current outlook that we're anticipating, we don't anticipate that these new registrant numbers will rise significantly over the near term. So what this does is it will lower the number of new completers each year that we anticipate to be available to the workforce through 18 to 2023. So if we look at the total of that 164,000 apprentices that are expected to register between 2019 and 13, about 32,800 are expected to end up completing over the next 5 years. So if we look at what this means, if we look a little closer about future supply of new apprentices and journey persons at a provincial level, you can see declines are expected in every province. Declines in new registrations are expected in every province except Ontario, where average annual registrations are projected to rise by 9% to just over 11,000 per year. Alberta is projected to experience the most significant decline. New registrations are expected to average just 8,700, and that represents about a 23% decline compared with the average annual average new registrants over the previous 5 years. Again, this just reflects the trends, the recent trends in employment in each of the provinces. Now, if we look at now at a trade level, the average total registrations for the top 10 red seal trades, you can see at a provincial level that the new registrations between 2019 and 23 are expected to decline again in every trade that we're looking at. Most significantly, maybe in construction electricians, as well as welders. Construction electricians is tied very closely to a residential sector construction, and being a compulsory trade in all provinces, the registrations tend to move very closely with employment requirements, and we will see, we're expected to see some declines in the number of new registrants in construction electrician, down from very high levels, because they also rose very quickly with the rising demands in the residential construction sector. Welder too, the new registrations we expect to fall there, and that's a function of continued weakness in the heavy industrial sector, where we're just not necessarily seeing the rebound in employment requirements over the near term. And we'll see next how these changes in registrations are likely to impact in completions. So when we bring all of this analysis together, we get to this chart that shows us potential gaps between supply and demand. And we'll start off at the provincial level. Now, what we've noticed, and again, this is really a function too of also the time periods that we're looking at, but the buildup in new registrations to peak levels in 2014 has translated now to high levels of completions in several trades through 2018 and 19. So that is contributing to a bit of an overshoot as we move forward. We're seeing in a number of provinces, specifically even Ontario and BC, as we move into the estimated demand for new journey persons between 2019 and 2023, which includes the period of past the peak as after 2021. The buildup of registrations, which is I think starting tried to keep pace over the recent years, translates to a lot of potentially a large number of new journey persons being completed after the peak demands have been met. So that's the case in Ontario. And again, this is only really relevant when you look at a combination of trade and province, but just for comparison's sake, I want to take a look at some of the differences across provinces. BC is an interesting case. Again, you can see that the total completions between 2013 and 18 fell behind the pace of demand, increases in demand over that same period. And I think that's contributing to the experience of skill shortages that are being reported in BC currently. Now, the increase in the registrations eventually, the modest rise does lead to an increase in completions over the next 5-year period. But again, that will include the 2-year period after 2021, where the peak requirements of some of the major infrastructure and energy sector projects like LNG Canada have already been met. So many of those apprentices will be, again, approaching or completing their apprenticeship just as those demands have fallen. In Alberta, you can see that here completions look like they've exceeded demands over between that 13 and 18 period. Again, we have to keep in mind that that 13 to 18 period includes the economic downturn fueled by the pullback in oil and gas sector investment. And you can also see that decline in registrations of close to 50% that we are tracking in Alberta leads to a significant decline in the number of anticipated completions between 2019 and 2023, just as demands begin to recover in the province, and could potentially grow significantly after 2023. So there is a bit of a potential risk looming in Alberta if registration and the number of apprentices stay at current low levels. Saskatchewan, again, similar story to Alberta, but not as dramatic in a smaller province. And Manitoba, again, facing a bit of a decline in demand requirements. There's a number of large hydro projects in there that's attracted a lot of skilled workers over the last few years, and as that work completes, the demands there are expected to decline slightly. So relatively stable situation. And Atlantic Canada, again, most of these the demands there are being driven by retirements from the workforce, but at the same time, you can see completions are anticipated to fall, and a lot of that is driven by the significant declines in apprenticeship registrations we recorded in Newfoundland. If you look at a trade-by-trade analysis, you get a much more varied story. Again, this includes the demand and supply across all provinces, but the analysis here suggests that there is a potential risk for certification requirements at a national level for specific trades, including welders, millwrights, as well as cooks. And if you recall back to some of the initial slides on changes in registrations, cook was one of the trades where we've seen declines and declining trends in new registrations all the way back to 2011. And that's responsible for that decline in the number of completions over the next 5 years, just as though there's an anticipated modest increase in demand requirements. So I guess the risk there to cooks is that a smaller share, if this persists, a smaller share of a proportion of cooks in the workforce are likely to be, red-field journeypersons. Carpenters, again, more balanced nationally. Some risk emerging for heavy-duty equipment mechanics over the longer term as completions fall, but demands start to creep up. We include this analysis at a trade level nationally, but it really is much more relevant to look at this analysis at both a trade and a provincial level to get a better sense of what the conditions are for any individual program and in the individual province, because again, the dynamics are quite different, and invite you to look much more closely at the provincial reports published by CAF and available online. So all this analysis then culminates in our assessment, bringing the supply and demand numbers together to try to identify those trades, again, that we feel might be potentially at risk versus those that we feel are generally, where demand and supply are generally balanced, and those that we think that there is an ample supply. And this national summary table just provides you with exactly that. So if you compare, what we're doing here essentially is looking for situations where the number of projected completions falls short of the certifications that we feel are required over a 5-year period. We identify those as potentially at risks, and those are marked here in red: cooks, industrial mechanics, and welders. And again, this is a national picture that we're painting. Where the projected completions are generally in line with where we see certification requirements, we'll characterize those programs as generally balanced. So those be heavy-duty equipment technicians, carpenters, steam fitters, auto service technicians. So those are ones that you generally want to keep an eye on to make sure that the demand requirements, certification requirements aren't running ahead, or a sudden decline in new registrations and completions in those programs. And there are other programs where, for a number of reasons, have attracted a significant number of registrants. And over the period that we're looking at here, the 5-year period, we're anticipating that there should be an ample supply of journeypersons completing at the other end to keep pace with the estimated certification requirements. So again, all of this work is to help provide some kind of tools and measures for industry and apprenticeship stakeholders to begin to start to set targets for registrants, to be able to monitor situations where the new apprenticeships might be falling below those requirements, and again, to help to be able to provide stakeholders with opportunities to prioritize certain trades over others, to make sure that there's long-term sustainability of the workforce across all trades and provinces. So this concludes an in-depth overview of the recent research and publication of the CAF report. And again, this is the first in a series that we're hoping to publish over the next few years, looking at different aspects of apprenticeship and different ways to understand changing demand requirements and what we're seeing in terms of trends and in registrations and completions, to assess whether industry is keeping pace. So I guess with that, I thank you for your time, and I will see if there's any questions from CAF that I will try to answer.
Great, thanks for that presentation, Adam. That was really helpful information. It's Emily Aerosmith here from the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum. We do have a couple of questions. So I see that your system is focused on the top 10 Red Seal trades, but what is the capacity of CanTrack to look at even more trades that have apprenticeship programs attached to them?
All right, thanks, Emily. That's a good question. Now, the system currently we've been working on is now able to track basically all programs at a provincial level where we have data. So where there are active programs of above 2 or 3 registrants per year, we're able to convert those programs, trace them back to occupations, and look for them in the workforce, and be able to track the demands against the supply. Obviously, there's a question as to at what level of where the numbers fall apart, where it's not relevant to track anymore. That's a judgment call, but we are able to track any program, whether there's any active program across Canada using the system.
Perfect, great, thank you. Every year, you said you're going to be doing these reports over the next couple of years for the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum. Do new projects that could create further demand for tradespeople and their skills, as new projects get approved, is that considered in the analysis?
Right, and that's a great question. I mean, that's really a key input and a differentiation of the system. We're relying on monitoring sources of labor market information across various sectors in the economy. One of the key inputs here is Buildforce Canada's construction outlook. So annually, we monitor any changes to decisions on major projects that could significantly change the trajectory for demand in any province for particular trades. Obviously, not just construction, but manufacturing and other sectors are considered. But projects like Bay du Nord in Newfoundland, or the timing of LNG Canada and BC, can significantly alter the demands for a particular year. So we're trying to stay on top of these requirements and readjust and recalibrate the system as we continue to track the demands.
Perfect, thank you. Also, what is the capacity of the CanTrack system to help apprenticeship stakeholders think about apprentice mobility across the country?
Right. Well, the way that we approach the analysis is we try to isolate the demands and supply to individual provinces. Of course, each province is kind of responsible for their own apprenticeship system and setting and managing their apprenticeship system. So the starting point here is to assess each province individually. And as you see from the analysis, there are suggestions that some growth and demands in certain provinces could exceed demands, and whereas a different case could emerge analysis in other provinces. So by providing that information, I think what we present is more of there's a potential for supply, a potential for mobility, and indicators of potential for mobility, and we hope that industry and stakeholders can use that information for their own HR planning demands. So where can you potentially look for apprentices or workers is basically the way to look at those differences across provinces.
Sure, great, thank you. In a slower growth environment, how do you see this affecting apprenticeship recruitment strategies, especially when it comes to underrepresented groups?
That's another good question, and I think this applies not just to skilled trades, but to all occupations and industries. Is as the retirement demands or replacement demands rise, even in a slower growth environment, employers are going to have to work harder and spread the net wider to try to attract workers and train workers to meet their requirements. So that's going to require employers to work harder and continue to attract some of these groups that are maybe currently underrepresented. And I think it actually becomes harder to attract workers to some skilled trades in a slower growth outlook. If the prospects don't look as shiny, as optimistic as they maybe did, during the peak of a resource boom. So those two factors together, I think, will require employers to utilize those, or do their best to utilize those, or access those groups, or attract those groups to a degree that they haven't had to before.
Perfect. Thank you, Adam.
No problem.
Thank you, Adam, for sharing such great insights on the emerging apprenticeship trends with us today. To keep in touch with the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum, please follow us on social media and keep an eye on our news and events page on our website to find out when CAF will be in your area next. Thanks, everybody.